John was ordinary. He lived a simple life, filled with routine. Wake up, coffee, work, dinner, sleep, repeat. His days were unremarkable. He liked it that way. Predictability was safe, comforting. He felt in control. He worked at a local library, surrounded by the comforting silence of books. The smell of aging paper was oddly calming. John was a man of habit. It started with a pain in his chest, sharp, sudden, like something tearing from within. He dismissed it as heartburn, a consequence of too much coffee, too much stress. He popped an antacid. The pain subsided, but the fear remained, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. Later that day, he noticed a mark on his arm, a small discolored patch of skin. It looked off, wrong, like something was eating away at him from the inside. Panic welled up in his chest. He tried to rationalize it. This was different. The discolored patch on John's arm refused to be ignored. It grew steadily, a dark stain against his pale skin. The edges felt strangely undefined, as if they blurred into his flesh. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a figment of his anxious mind. His reflection in the mirror told a different story. The patch seemed to pulsate faintly, a grotesque heartbeat under his skin. His eyes, usually bright blue, were now dull and lifeless. His skin, once vibrant, now had a sickly pallor. He tried to cover the mark with bandages, with long sleeves, but it felt like a losing battle. The decay was relentless. It whispered to him in the quiet moments, a constant, insidious presence that chipped away at his sanity. Sleep offered no escape. Driven by a desperate hope, John sought medical help. He visited doctors, specialists, anyone who would listen. He endured countless tests, each more invasive than the last. Blood work, biopsies, scans, they all came back inconclusive. The doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. Some suggested it was psychosomatic, a manifestation of stress. John felt a flicker of anger amidst the fear. He was trapped in a nightmare, unable to articulate the terror that consumed him. The decay was no longer a silent predator. The pain intensified, a constant gnawing sensation that spread from his chest to his limbs. The discolored patch on his arm spread, a web of decay that crept across his skin. He began to lose feeling in his fingers, a numbness that spread like ice through his veins. His reflection in the mirror became a stranger, a grotesque parody of the man he once was. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin stretched taut over protruding bones. John was staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. The stench hit him first, a putrid, sweet odor like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. It clung to him, seeped from his pores. Shame washed over him, hot and suffocating. He scrubbed his skin until it bled, but the smell remained, a constant reminder of his decaying body. He couldn't hide it anymore. The decay spread across his skin in a macabre mosaic of sickly greens and purples. His flesh sloughed off with the lightest touch, leaving raw, weeping sores. The pain was relentless, a gnawing hunger that devoured him from the inside out. His once comforting apartment became a prison. Loneliness became a living thing, wrapping its icy fingers around his throat, squeezing the last vestiges of hope from his lungs. He craved human contact, a voice, a touch, anything to break through the suffocating isolation. He tried to reach out. He dialed his sister's number, his fingers trembling. The phone rang, each tone a hammer blow to his resolve. He hung up before the answering machine picked up. How could he explain? How could he subject her to the horror he had become? He was a monster, hidden away in his decaying shell. He was adrift in a sea of despair, the shore of sanity, a distant, fading memory. One night, as John drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, a sound cut through the haze of pain and despair. A scratching at his apartment door. He lay there, heart pounding, unsure if it was real or another cruel trick of his decaying mind. The scratching came again. More insistent this time. He dragged himself from the couch, his body protesting every movement. The stench hit him full force, a wave of nausea washing over him. He stumbled towards the door, each step an agonizing effort. He peered through the peephole. His vision swam with dark spots, but he could make out a figure on the other side. A woman, young, with kind eyes and a worried frown. She held up a book, its cover familiar to John. The door creaked open, a sound like breaking bones in the suffocating silence of John's apartment. The air was thick, almost tangible, with an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow every other sound. The young woman stood on his threshold, her smile faltering, as the stench of decay hit her with the force of a physical blow. She instinctively covered her nose, her eyes watering from the intensity of the smell. Her eyes widened, taking in the skeletal figure before her, the sickly pallor of his skin, the way his clothes hung loosely on his emaciated frame. It was as if she was looking at a ghost, a mere shadow of the man she once knew. "John?" she breathed, her voice a mix of concern and dawning horror. She took a hesitant step forward, unsure if she should cross the threshold. "Are you all right?" He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His throat felt like sandpaper, his tongue thick and clumsy in his mouth. He swallowed painfully, trying to muster the strength to speak. He could only manage a raspy croak, a sound that was more animal than human. It was a pitiful attempt at communication. Shame washed over him, hot and suffocating. He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but he knew there were no words that could adequately convey the horror he felt, the nightmare his life had become. His eyes pleaded with her to understand. He gestured weakly to the book in her hand, the gesture awkward and uncoordinated. His hand trembled, barely able to lift. She looked down at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. The book seemed out of place in this grim setting. "You recommended this to me," she said slowly, as if speaking to a frightened animal. Her voice was gentle, trying to bridge the gap between them. I thought you might like to talk about it." She extended the book towards him, hoping it might spark a connection, a way back to the man she once knew. John saw the fear in her eyes, the revulsion, and his heart, already so fragile, cracked a little more. He had seen that look before in the mirror, every day. He stumbled back, a strangled sob escaping his lips. The weight of his own despair was too much to bear. He wanted to scream at her to leave, that he wasn't worth saving, that he was already lost to the abyss that consumed him from within. The darkness had taken root deep inside him. But still, a part of him clung to the hope she represented, the hope of connection, of normalcy, of a life that was no longer within his grasp. It was a cruel irony, this glimmer of hope. He watched as she took a tentative step into the apartment, her gaze darting around the dimly lit space, taking in the disarray, the empty pill bottles, the pervasive stench of decay. It was a scene of utter desolation. "It's all right, John," she said, her voice soft, soothing. "I'm here now." Her words were like a balm, but he knew they couldn't heal the wounds he carried. He wanted to believe her, to lose himself in the warmth of her presence, but the decay wouldn't allow it. It was a relentless force, always there, always gnawing at him. It pulsed beneath his skin, a constant reminder of the horror he carried within, a horror that no amount of love or kindness could erase. He watched as she approached him, her hand outstretched. Her gesture was one of pure compassion, but it felt like a dagger to his heart. He flinched away, his own hand instinctively rising to cover the discolored patch on his arm. The mark was a symbol of his inner torment, a torment he couldn't escape. The woman's presence, though born of kindness, was a painful reminder of everything John had lost, everything he could no longer have. Her eyes, filled with concern, only deepened his sense of despair. The decay, as if sensing his despair, seemed to surge within him, a wave of nausea and dizziness washing over him. It was as if his body was rebelling against his very existence. He stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch, his body racked with tremors. Each shudder felt like a prelude to the end, a harbinger of the inevitable. He could feel his flesh crawling, his bones grinding against each other, a symphony of pain and decay. Every movement was agony, every breath a struggle. He looked up at the woman, his vision blurring at the edges. Her figure seemed to waver, a ghostly apparition in his failing sight. "It's too late," he croaked, his voice barely audible. The words felt like a final admission of defeat. The words felt alien, detached from his thoughts, as if spoken by the thing that was consuming him from within. He was no longer in control. He couldn't bear to see her fear, couldn't bear to witness his own transformation reflected in her eyes. It was a mirror he wished to shatter. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness that beckoned him. The final transformation was upon him, and there was no turning back. Silence fell like a shroud. The air, thick with the stench of decay, hung heavy and still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a jarring reminder of normalcy in the face of the grotesque. The young woman stood frozen, her hand still clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. John, or what remained of him, lay on the couch, his body contorted at an unnatural angle. His chest, no longer rising and falling with the rhythm of breath, was eerily still. She struggled to comprehend what she had just witnessed. The man she knew, the quiet librarian with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, was gone. In his place was something else. The silence stretched, each second an eternity. Her gaze fell on the book she had brought, its bright cover a stark contrast against the darkness of the apartment. She had been so eager to share it with John, so sure he would enjoy the story. Now it felt like a cruel joke, a symbol of the life he had lost, the connection they would never have. She took a step back, then another, her eyes never leaving the monstrous form on the couch. She stumbled over something, a discarded coffee mug, and the sound, sharp and unexpected, broke the spell. Her gaze darted to the figure on the couch, then back to the book. A terrifying thought took root in her mind. What if it wasn't over? She reached the door, her hand trembling as she fumbled with the lock. As she stepped out into the hallway, she took one last look back. The creature, bathed in the dim light of the apartment, hadn't moved, but she could have sworn she saw its head turn, its eyes, two glowing embers in the darkness, following her movements. She slammed the door shut and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the creature was following her. The questions lingered, sharp and unsettling, like shards of glass in her mind.